The room was underground, and it was always too warm. Vacuum tubes ran hot in the racks along the wall, and the men who worked there sat in shirt sleeves with headphones clamped over their ears, listening to two Germans argue about coffee. That was most of the job. Coffee, rations, wives, football, the rumor that someone in Cell 9 had a brother in the Kriegsmarine. Hours of nothing. Then a voice would drop half a sentence into the middle of the nothing, and the man at the desk would stop the pencil, back the needle up on the acetate disc, and listen to it again. He had heard this particular sentence before. Not the exact wording, because the wording changed depending on who was saying it, whether he was a sergeant from Silesia or a colonel with a Knight's Cross. But the shape of the sentence never changed. A German soldier would be describing what it was like to fight the Americans, and somewhere in that description, he would say a version of the same thing. Not that the Americans were brave, not that they were skilled, something else. Something the men in the listening room had begun to write down separately, in the margins, because it kept turning up, and nobody had asked them to track it. By the end of the war, they had thousands of pages of it. German prisoners, from field marshals down to 18-year-old conscripts who had been in uniform for 6 weeks, sitting in comfortable rooms and speaking freely because they were certain nobody could hear them. And in those pages, buried in the ordinary chatter of captivity, was a single recurring observation about the American way of fighting. It was not a compliment, it was not exactly an insult either. It was closer to the way a man describes weather that killed someone he knew. Those recordings stayed classified for more than 50 years. When a historian finally pulled them out of the archives in 2001, he found about 150,000 pages of transcripts. And what was in them changed how we understand the German soldiers' war. This is what they kept saying about us, and why it took half a century for anyone to hear it. You have to start with what the Germans thought before they ever met an American in the field, because the gap between the expectation and the reality is the whole story. By the winter of 1941, the German army had beaten everyone it had fought. Poland collapsed in about 5 weeks, Denmark went in a day, Norway, the Low Countries, and then France, which had been expected to hold for a year, and instead came apart in 6 weeks against an opponent it outnumbered in tanks. British and French officers who had studied the last war carefully were being outmaneuvered by men who had studied the same war and drawn different conclusions. German officers were not being arrogant when they believed their army was the best in the world. For a while it was, and the evidence was sitting on a map. Then came the propaganda layer on top of that, which was a different animal. The Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment had spent years building a picture of America for German consumption. And the picture was of a country too soft and too mixed and too distracted to fight. A nation of dance halls and department stores. Hermann Goering, who ran the Luftwaffe and had a talent for saying things that aged badly, dismissed American war production with a line about razor blades. They could make refrigerators and razor blades. They could not make an air force. German officers repeated the joke. Then February of 1943 happened, and for about a week, it looked like the joke was true. Kasserine Pass was the American Army's first serious meeting with the Wehrmacht, and it went badly enough that people were still writing about it 40 years later, as a case study in what green troops do under pressure. American units broke. Communications collapsed. Officers gave orders that never arrived and then gave contradictory ones that did. Equipment was left in the desert. Somewhere in the range of 6,000 Americans were killed, wounded or captured in a matter of days. Rommel, who had been fighting the British for 2 years and had a low opinion of most people, looked at the American performance and noted the inexperience of it, the way they lost the shape of the battle once the shooting started. Omar Bradley arrived afterward and saw local scavengers going through the dead for boots and clothing. He wrote about it later. It was not the kind of thing you forget. So, the Germans had their proof. The Americans were amateurs with good equipment. That assessment lasted about 11 months. What replaced it was not admiration for the American riflemen. Plenty of German officers went to their graves thinking American infantry tactics were sloppy. And some of them had a point. What replaced contempt was a specific and very physical fear, and it had almost nothing to do with the man holding the rifle. It had to do with what that man could reach for. To understand how we know all this, you have to know about two houses and one very strange stretch of riverbank in Virginia. In 1942, the United States War Department took over a piece of land on the Potomac that had once been part of George Washington's farmland. On the maps, it was Fort Hunt. In official correspondence, it did not exist at all. It had a mailing address, P.O. Box 1142, and that was the only name most people ever attached to it. 80-odd buildings went up behind wire. The soldiers stationed there were told, in writing and repeatedly, that they were not to tell anyone what they did. Not their wives, not their parents, not other soldiers. Mail out of the facility was read. The men who worked there spent the next 50 years telling their families they had been clerks. Between the middle of 1942 and the summer of 1945, something in the range of 3,450 prisoners came through that address. 15 of them were German generals. Some were U-boat commanders pulled out of the Atlantic. Some were engineers who had worked on the rockets falling on London. They were interrogated, and the interrogations produced good material, but the interrogations were the small half of the operation. The other half was that every room was wired. The microphones were not the discreet little things you imagine. Some of them were the size of a melon, hidden above light fixtures and inside walls and built into the furniture. Down in a concrete bunker outside the wire, monitors worked in shifts around the clock with headphones on, transcribing in real time, and cutting the important passages onto discs. They were listening for two men alone in a room, saying the thing they would never say to an interrogator's face. Over the course of the war, that operation generated something like 5,000 intelligence reports. The men doing the listening are worth a paragraph of their own. A large number of them were German Jews who had gotten out as children in the 30s, some of whom had lost most of their families to the machine these prisoners had served. They had been given emergency citizenship at a courthouse down the road and handed a headset. They knew the slang. They knew what a man from Hamburg sounded like when he was lying. Some of them worked the interrogation side instead, and their method was not what you would expect from men with that history. They played chess with Nazi generals. They brought coffee. They talked about music and university towns. One of them, who went on to a career in physics after the war, said at a reunion decades later that a chess game got more out of a German general than torture ever would. He was not being sentimental. He was describing a technique that worked. And the reason it worked was that the prisoner walked back to his room, relaxed and talkative, and the room was listening. When the war ended, the order came down to destroy everything within 24 hours. Men fed classified paper into fires until the fires went out. The secret held for decades, largely because the men who knew it had been told to keep it and simply did. The British were running the same play on a grander scale and with better furniture. North of London, there was a country estate called Trent Park, and by the last 2 years of the war, it housed a rotating population of captured German generals living in conditions that would have embarrassed a British colonel. Billiards, a library, beer and whiskey, long walks on landscaped grounds with a friendly British officer who was, in fact, a professional intelligence man playing a part. The comfort was the point. A man who feels defeated and humiliated says nothing. A man who feels respected talks constantly. Microphones were in the light fittings and the fireplaces and the skirting boards. They were in the plant pots. There is a persistent story that they were in the trees, along the garden paths, which sounds like invention, until you remember these were the same people who bugged a billiard table. One captured general was recorded reassuring a colleague that the British were far too stupid to have thought of wiring the rooms. That conversation survives because they had wired the rooms. Something like 10,000 transcripts came out of the British sites. Everything went into the archives afterward and sat there. In 2001, a German historian named Sönke Neitzel was working in the British archives on a completely different question, submarine warfare, and stumbled into the files. He found the transcripts, then went looking in the American archives and found more. Roughly 150,000 pages of German soldiers talking to each other with no idea that history was in the room. He published the generals' conversations in 2007. A few years later, with the social psychologist Harold Welser, he published a much harder book built from the rank and file material which dealt with how ordinary soldiers talked about killing when they thought they were among friends. That book is not comfortable reading, and it was not meant to be. But threaded all the way through both sets of material, from the general in the billiard room to the private in the holding cell, is the thing this video is about. Ask a German soldier what the Americans were like. And eventually, always, he talks about the artillery. Here is what that meant on the ground. An American infantry platoon in France in 1944 did not, as a general rule, want to fight you. If it found you, it stopped. Somewhere behind that platoon was a man with a radio and a map, and that man's entire job was to describe your position to people you could not see. Depending on the day and the sector, the time between that description and the arrival of the first shells could be a matter of minutes. German soldiers worked this out fast, and the conclusion they drew was strange enough that they kept repeating it in captivity. The most dangerous American on the battlefield was not the one shooting at you, it was the one talking. One German veteran, years later, put it in terms of sound. The thing that frightened men in the line, he said, was the crackle of an American radio. Not the sight of a tank, not the crack of an M1. The static. Because the static meant that somebody had seen you, and that the sky was already committed. The Americans had a technique for this that the Germans came to talk about the way people talk about a natural disaster. It was called time on target, and the idea behind it was so simple that the difficulty was entirely in the arithmetic. Normally, when several batteries fire at the same target from different distances, their shells land in a ragged sequence. The first arrivals tell everyone on the ground to get down, and the men who get down survive the rest. That first ranging round is the warning that keeps soldiers alive. Time on target removed the warning. Every battery calculated the exact flight time of its own shells to the target, which meant accounting for range, elevation, air temperature, wind at altitude, the wear on the individual gun barrel, the lot number of the propellant. Then the batteries fired at staggered times, the far guns first, the near guns last, so that everything arrived in the same 3-second window. 12 guns, 36 guns, on some occasions a great deal more, all landing at once out of a silent sky. Think about what that does to a man. There is no build. There is no moment of recognition. You are eating, or writing a letter, or arguing with someone about nothing, and then the ground is inside out, and half the people you were sitting with are gone. Men who had done 2 winters on the Eastern Front. Men who had seen things at Rzhev and Kharkov that they could not describe to civilians, described time on target as the worst thing that ever happened to them. It was the arbitrariness of it more than the violence. Skill did not help. Cover you had dug yourself did not help, because the shells were on top of you before your body had processed the first sound. The numbers behind that experience are almost boring, and that is the point. Near Dom-Butgenbach, during the Ardennes fighting in late December of 1944, artillery supporting the American 1st Infantry Division put something over 10,000 rounds into attacking German armor in a single day. When the 9th Army crossed the Rhine in March of 1945, around 270 guns opened the operation, and the opening bombardment alone consumed tens of thousands of shells. Outside St. Lo in July of 1944, in the fight for Hill 192, an American division was throwing as many as 20 separate time on-target concentrations at German positions in a single night. Not as a maximum effort, as a routine. And then, the ammunition came back the next morning. That last part is what broke people. German artillery in 1944 was not bad. In some categories, the guns were excellent. But a German battery commander was rationing. He was firing captured French and Czech and Soviet pieces alongside his own, because that was what was available. And each of those guns ate different ammunition, and the supply chain for all of it was being taken apart from the air. He was moving guns with horses, and the horses were being strafed. He had to decide every single day which target was worth shells and which one was not. His American counterpart did not have to have that thought. If the mission was called, the mission was fired, and there would be more in the morning. There is a version of this war in the popular imagination where the fighting is decided by tanks meeting each other in fields. It mostly was not. Something in the neighborhood of half to two-thirds of battlefield casualties in that war came from artillery. And the Germans knew exactly which side owned that statistic. The second thing they said about us came from directly overhead. Rommel got there first, before American troops were even a factor. Writing after the fighting at Alam Halfa in 1942, he laid out what it meant to fight an enemy who owned the air. And he did it in a sentence that circulated among German officers for the rest of the war. A man fighting a modern enemy without air cover, he wrote, is in the position of a tribesman with a spear facing a European army with the same disadvantages and the same prospects. He was not being poetic. He was describing his own force, and he was describing his own prospects. By June of 1944, he was writing to his wife from Normandy 4 days after the landings, and the tone had gone from analytical to something else. Allied air power, he told her, was affecting everything they tried to do, and there was no answer to it. Not a bad answer, no answer. There is a story from earlier, at a conference in Germany, where Rommel raised the air situation in North Africa, and Göring repeated the razor blades line. Rommel is supposed to have replied that he would be glad to have some of those razor blades. Whether the words are exact hardly matters. Officers passed it around because it was true. The Germans built a word for what came out of the sky, which is usually a sign that something has become part of daily life. Jabo, short for jagged bomber, fighter bomber. It was a noun, and it became a verb, and it became a reason not to move, from first light to last. Over the whole of northern France, American and British fighter bombers patrolled the roads looking for anything with an engine. Trucks, half-tracks, staff cars, ammunition columns, horse teams. A single motorcyclist on an empty road would draw a pass from a P-47. German pilots had laughed at the P-47 when it arrived. It was enormous, the heaviest single-engine fighter anyone fielded, and it looked wrong in the air, like something built by people who had misunderstood the assignment. Then it turned out that the size was the whole idea. It could absorb hits that should have brought it down, carry bombs and rockets and still fight, dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe had, and put 8 heavy machine guns into a truck column for as long as the ammunition lasted. The mockery stopped early. The German command's own words on this are blunt to the point of despair. Adolf Galland, who ran the fighter arm, wrote afterward that from the first hour of the invasion, the Allies had complete air supremacy, and that everyone, the troops and the civilians both, kept asking the same question about where the Luftwaffe had gone. A senior staff officer in France reported that no daylight movement was possible anywhere in his area, and he meant that literally, as an operational fact, that shaped every order he wrote. Field Marshal von Kluge, after he took over from the wounded Rommel in Normandy, sent Hitler an assessment that no field marshal wants to sign. Against air power on that scale, he wrote, there was no tactic available to them except leaving the battlefield. Read that again. A German field marshal telling his head of state that the professional answer to the problem is retreat, because the problem has no professional answer. Rommel's naval aide made the coldest observation of the group. The Anglo-American use of air power, he wrote, was the modern form of turning a flank, except that the flank was not on the side anymore, it was above. Every German victory from Poland onward had been built on maneuver, on getting around the enemy's edge faster than he could reorient. There is no getting around an enemy who is on top of you. So the Germans stopped moving in daylight. Supply ran at night, formations shifted in fog. Operations were planned around weather forecasts the way a farmer plans around rain. And when Hitler launched his last offensive in the West in December of 1944, the timing was chosen almost entirely because the forecast promised low cloud that would keep the Allied air forces on the ground. It worked, for a while. Then, the weather broke on the 23rd, the sky filled up, and everyone on the German side who understood what that meant, understood it within about a day. The third thing they said is the one that got underneath everything else, because it was not about a weapon at all. Materialschlacht, the battle of material. It is not a compliment in German, and it was not meant as one. It described a war that was not being decided by courage or training or the brilliance of the operational plan, but by which side could produce more objects and get them to the right field. Shells, trucks, boots, radios, blood plasma, tinned food, spare tracks for tanks. The German officer corps had been raised on an idea of war as a contest of skill and will, and the Americans were quietly demonstrating that war was a manufacturing problem with a body count attached. There is a story out of Normandy in the summer of 1944, told and retold in various forms, about a column of German prisoners being marched to the rear past the American supply dumps at the beachhead. Crates stacked to the height of houses, going back further than the eye could follow, in a field that had been empty a month earlier. One of the prisoners is supposed to have said that he finally understood how they had lost. "You piled it all up," he said, "and then you dropped it on us." Rommel again had seen it coming years earlier. "The battle is decided by the quartermasters," he wrote, "before the fighting begins." He said it as a warning to his own side, and nobody with the power to fix it listened. The scale was genuinely difficult for German soldiers to process, because they had been told the opposite for a decade. An American rifleman in 1944 was eating on the order of 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, and complaining about it because the food was monotonous and came out of a tin. German units in the same season were increasingly eating whatever was locally available, and by 1945, some of them were on less than half of what the men across the line were getting. When a Sherman burned, and Shermans burned, another one showed up. The crew that survived was back in a tank inside a week. When a German panzer was knocked out, that was frequently the end of it, because the recovery vehicle had no fuel, and the workshop was 200 kilometers away, and the road to it was being patrolled by thunderbolts. You can be the better soldier in that situation. It stops mattering. The clearest single description of what all of this felt like comes from a man who had every reason to describe it honestly and no reason to flatter anyone. Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, which was about as good as German armored formations got in 1944, built around instructors and demonstration troops with modern equipment and real training. On the 25th of July, 1944, his division was sitting in the target box for Operation Cobra. The Americans put roughly 2,500 aircraft over an area a few miles wide and a mile or so deep and dropped thousands of tons of bombs into it. Bayerlein was underneath. Writing afterward for the U.S. Army's historical program, he described what the bombing did to men rather than to equipment, which is what makes the account valuable. The length of it, he wrote, with no possibility of hitting back, produced depression and a sense of helplessness and inferiority, and enough of his men reached the point of thinking further resistance was pointless that they began surrendering, deserting, or running for the rear. Infantry in prepared positions were killed in their holes, or buried alive by blast. Tanks were flipped. He described the target area as craters with nothing living in them. Bayerlein had a resume. Poland in 1939, France in 1940, North Africa as Rommel's chief of staff, through the good months and the bad ones. The Eastern Front, where the scale of everything was worse than anywhere else on Earth. He had been present for as much of the war as any German officer alive. And when he came to describe Cobra, he wrote that for him, a man who had served at the point of main effort in every theater, this was the worst thing he had ever seen. Not Stalingrad, which he had not seen personally, but not El Alamein either, and not the Eastern Front, which he had. A morning in Normandy. Now for the part that complicates the story. Because if I only told you the flattering half, I would be doing the same thing the propaganda ministries did. German soldiers were not impressed with American infantry, and they said so constantly. In the recordings and the post-war reports, the criticism is specific and it repeats. Americans bunched up. They moved in clumps that were an artilleryman's dream. Their fire discipline was poor, spraying ammunition at tree lines where a trained man would have waited for a target. Their camouflage was careless. They were noisy, on the radio and off it. They tended to break contact and call for support, rather than push a flanking element around a position which German officers read as a reluctance to close. Patton, of all people, agreed with the diagnosis while rejecting the conclusion. Talking to a French officer, He said flatly that the worse the infantry, the more artillery it needs, and that American infantry needed everything it could get. He was not insulting his own men. He was describing a doctrine he had helped build and had no intention of apologizing for. But the German criticism almost always came with a second half, and the second half is more interesting. One veteran described Americans as enthusiastic amateurs with an appetite for aggression he had not seen in any other army he fought. What he meant was that you could not punish them into caution. Hit an American unit and it did not go quiet and pull back to think. It shot back immediately, in volume, then called down everything available on your position, and then, while you were still deaf, it came at you. Whatever they lacked in craft they made up for, by refusing to accept being hit. Rommel put the learning curve in writing. The Americans paid a heavy tuition in Tunisia, he wrote, and it bought them a great deal. He noted that even in 1943, their generals were showing real sophistication in how they handled formations, though it took until the pursuit across France to see what they could really do with mobile warfare. That is the man who beat them at Kasserine, saying, in effect, that they went from embarrassing to astonishing in about a year and a half. Whatever else you think about the American Army of 1944, that rate of improvement is the thing that should impress you, and it is the thing German officers found hardest to explain to themselves. Then came the Ardennes, and the last real test of the argument. Something over 200,000 German troops and 1,000+ armored vehicles came through the forest in December of 1944, along roughly the same axis that had worked so beautifully in 1940. The plan required speed. It required specific road junctions to be taken on specific days, because the fuel situation meant that a delay of 48 hours was the same thing as failure. Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army and had a reputation for saying what he thought, later gave the credit for wrecking that timetable to the American defense of Sankt Vith. A scratch force held that road junction for the better part of a week against everything sent at it. Every hour that junction stayed American was an hour of German fuel burned going nowhere. Further south, the 101st Airborne and pieces of an armored division sat in Bastogne and refused to leave. And when a German delegation came forward under a white flag to demand surrender, the acting American commander sent back a one-word reply that the German officers had to have explained to them. They were told, eventually, that it was roughly equivalent to telling them to go to hell. There is a smaller story from that battle that says more about the German position than the big ones do. Friedrich von der Heydt was a professional paratroop officer with a serious record. Crete, North Africa, Normandy. For the Ardennes, he was handed Germany's last airborne operation, a night drop behind the American lines to seize crossroads and spread confusion. He later wrote that he had never in his career commanded a unit with less fighting spirit. The men were scraped out of replacement pools, a lot of them boys, a lot of them older men who had no business in a parachute harness, and most of them had never jumped at all. The transport crews had no night navigation experience worth the name. When he protested that this was not a force that could do the job, Field Marshal Model told him something remarkable. Model put the whole offensive's chance of success at under 10%. He said it out loud to a subordinate before it began. And then he said it had to be attempted anyway, because it was the last chance to end the war on anything other than the enemy's terms. The drop went exactly as von der Heydt expected. High winds, inexperienced pilots, men scattered across miles of forest. He assembled a few hundred out of the 1,200 he needed. The radios were gone. The heavy weapons were gone. Unable to take anything, he sat in the trees and watched American reinforcements drive past him toward the front in numbers that told him everything he needed to know about how the offensive was going. He let his American prisoners go, sent his wounded off with them to get treatment from the enemy, and on the 23rd of December walked into an American position and surrendered rather than freeze. The Americans were also introducing something new in that battle, and the Germans noticed within days. The proximity fuse was a tiny radar set in the nose of a shell that detected the ground or a target approaching and detonated the round in the air above it, spraying fragments downward into positions that would have been safe from a contact burst. The whole logic of surviving artillery, which is to get below ground level and wait, stopped working. Men who had lived through 2 years of bombardment by digging deep were killed by shells that never touched the earth. Patton wrote to the chief of ordnance about it with an enthusiasm that is uncomfortable to read now, describing a German battalion caught in the open at a river crossing and counted afterward in the hundreds. German prisoners described the effect and said there was nothing to be done about it, which was accurate. By early 1945, the German army was fighting 2 different wars with 2 different psychologies, and everyone in it knew which one they wanted. In the East, men fought past the point of any military logic because of what was known or believed about Soviet captivity. The stories that came back were of starvation and forced labor and years in camps, and enough of it was true that the fear was rational. Post-war West German investigations put the number of German prisoners who died in Soviet hands above 1 million, though Russian figures are far lower and the argument over the real number is not settled. In the West, resistance in the final months was often thinner than the equipment and the positions would suggest. And the reason was not cowardice, it was arithmetic. A German soldier who surrendered to the Americans had a very good chance of coming home. So men found ways to be captured, and units that would have died in place against the Red Army put their hands up in front of a rifle squad from Ohio. What happened to them next did more damage to Nazi ideology than any leaflet ever dropped. Around 370,000 German prisoners were in the United States by the end of the war, spread across camps in almost every state. They crossed the Atlantic in convoys and then crossed the country by rail, and the rail journey shows up again and again in their accounts. Because they had been told for years that America was a decaying place on the edge of collapse. And here they were being moved through it in passenger cars, looking out at cities with all their windows intact. There is a man named Georg who was captured in 1944 and sent to a camp in Washington state, and who came back at the age of 91 decades later, specifically to say thank you. What he remembered most clearly, out of everything, was standing in front of the camp canteen trying to choose between an ice cream and a Coca-Cola. He had not seen ice cream since before the rationing. He had never tasted Coca-Cola in his life. He bought both. Another prisoner held in Nebraska said, "The treatment was excellent, the food was excellent, and the clothing was adequate," which is the most German way imaginable of admitting that the enemy had been decent to him. They worked. Farm labor, mostly, and canneries and timber, filling in for the American men who were overseas. And in the process, they spent 2 or 3 years looking at the country they had been told did not have the stomach for a war, and forming their own conclusions about who had been lying to them. Here is the thing that gets me about all of this, and it is the reason I wanted to make this video. On the American side of that ledger, almost nobody knew. The men whose radio calls the Germans feared, the forward observers, and the gun crews, and the riflemen who kept getting back up, mostly came home, took jobs, and stopped talking about it. They never read a transcript. Nobody told them that a German general had called their morning's work the worst thing he had seen in 6 years of war. Their own paperwork was thin, a few lines on a discharge form, and a good deal of what did exist burned in a records fire in Street Louis in 1973, which is how families end up where they are now. A name, a photograph of a young man squinting into the sun, and a box of objects nobody ever explained. That is what my book is for. Find Your Grandfather's War walks you through the records that survived, the ones that did not, and the paper trails most families never think to check. So you can rebuild what he actually did from almost nothing. The link is in the description, if that sounds like your family. Because the record is a strange thing. Some men are remembered by accident, and some are remembered by people who had every reason not to. In the Hurtgen Forest in November of 1944, in one of the worst pieces of fighting the American army did in Europe, a German lieutenant named Friedrich Lengfeld was holding a company position in ground that had been heavily mined. An American soldier stepped on a mine somewhere out in the dead space between the lines and was wounded badly enough that he could not move, but not badly enough to die quickly. He called for help for hours. Everyone on both sides could hear him. Lengfeld gave an order to his men that they were not to fire on any American medics who came out to get him. Nobody came, or the attempts that were made could not get through the mines. The calling went on. Eventually, Lengfeld decided he was going to go out himself, with his own medics and a Red Cross flag, and bring an enemy soldier back to the German lines to be treated. He stepped on a mine on the way out and died of his wounds that evening. 50 years later, American veterans of the 22nd Infantry Regiment, the men who had been on the other side of that ground, paid for a memorial to him and placed it in the German war cemetery at Hürtgen. It says that no man has greater love than the one who lays down his life for his enemy. As far as anyone has been able to determine, it is the only monument in a German war cemetery placed there by American soldiers to honor a German officer. The recordings caught that side of the war too, and worse. At Trent Park in October of 1944, General Dietrich von Choltitz, who had been the military governor of Paris and had chosen not to carry out an order to destroy the city, was recorded talking about guilt, not about the Americans, about himself, and the men like him. He said they all shared in it, that they had gone along with everything, that they had half taken the Nazis seriously instead of telling them what their nonsense was worth. He said he had fed his own soldiers that rubbish and that he was ashamed of himself. Other transcripts are much harder. Generals discussing the murder of Jews in the East with a matter-of-factness that ends the old argument about how much the Wehrmacht knew. Junior officers describing shootings the way you would describe a work detail. Men who had been on the Eastern Front comparing what they had done in a tone that suggests they had had this conversation many times before. Neitzel and Welzer's work with the rank-and-file transcripts is the material that makes the clean Wehrmacht story impossible to hold on to, and it is not why most people come to this subject. But it is in the same boxes as everything else I have described. You do not get one without the other. So what is the honest verdict from the men who were on the receiving end? They thought they were better soldiers, and there is some evidence they were not entirely wrong about it. Trevor Dupuy, an American colonel who spent his career running combat data through statistical models, concluded that German ground forces generally inflicted casualties at higher rates than they took when engaged against British and American forces, under comparable conditions. That analysis has been argued about for 40 years, and the methodology has real critics. But even the critics tend to concede that German small unit performance was, on average, very good indeed. And it did not matter. It could not matter against the three things the prisoners kept coming back to. Fire that could be summoned by voice and would arrive without warning in quantities nobody needed to justify. Aircraft that made a road in daylight a place you did not go. And behind both of those, a supply system that treated the destruction of American equipment as a paperwork problem rather than a loss. Max Hastings put the paradox better than anyone in his book on the last year of the war, and his version is worth sitting with because it refuses to be comfortable. He argued that as a fighting instrument, Hitler's army was better than the American and British armies, measured the way soldiers measure each other. Then he added the part that reframes it. If the Western Allies had produced soldiers as good as the Waffen-SS, or as willing to die as some Red Army units, they would have had to be the kind of people who produced such soldiers, formed by the same tyranny and the same brutality. Democracies pay for their soldiers' decency in casualties and in time. And Hastings' point is that this is a bill worth paying rather than a weakness to apologize for. American soldiers were not fanatics. They were insurance salesmen and farmhands and college kids who wanted the thing finished so they could go home. And when they had the option of solving a problem with a radio call instead of a bayonet charge, they took it every single time. That is not cowardice. It is what an army does when it believes the lives of its own men are worth more than a reputation for bravery. The last of these men are gone now. The Fort Hunt veterans who finally started talking in the mid-2000s after a Park Service historian went looking for them and a newspaper story put the facility on the front page for the first time were in their 80s and 90s then, and there were only about 70 of them left to interview. The German prisoners who marveled at ice cream in Nebraska have followed them. Nobody alive remembers any of this firsthand, but the paper is still there. 150,000 pages of men speaking with complete honesty because they were certain the room was empty, which is the only condition under which most people tell the truth about a war. And when researchers go through those pages now, the same things keep surfacing. The shells that came out of a silent sky, the aircraft that owned the daylight, the columns of trucks that kept coming no matter how many were destroyed. That sergeant, walking out of the trees in Belgium with his hands up, the one who muttered something about the shells before anyone had even taken his rifle, was eventually put on a ship, and then on a train, and then in a camp somewhere in the American interior. We do not have his name. The records that would have told us what became of him are gone or were never made. But we know what he said because thousands of men in his position said versions of the same sentence into microphones they did not know were there. They said the Americans fought with machines instead of men. They said the deadliest weapon in the American arsenal was a radio. They said that no amount of German courage was going to outlast American steel. And that once you understood that, everything after it was just a matter of how long you were willing to take. And then they were fed and housed and shipped across an ocean to a country that had not been touched. And a good number of them spent the rest of their lives quietly wondering how they had ever believed the men who told them America was weak.